have him do a second one.
The time is 7 o'clock, and we will call to order the last city council meeting for the year December 19th, 2019. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Here.
Mrs. Keller?
Here.
Mr. Hoffman?
Here.
Mr. Farrell?
Here.
Mr. Hellinger?
Here.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Here.
Mayor Riggle?
Here. Tonight's invocation will be led by our clerk, Elaine McCloskey, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise.
I apologize, I don't really have a whole lot prepared. I believe it's, Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us always, satisfy the needs that need to be met during this meeting. As we gather to make decisions for our community, may we always use our best skills and judgment, and help us to represent fairly and well. Amen.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Elaine. If you'll read item 4 into the minutes.
Would you like to do them together again?
Yes.
Approval of the motion summary of the regular meeting of council held on December 9th, 2019 as recorded and transcribed, and approval of the motion summary of the budget work session meeting of council held on December 5th, 2019 as recorded and transcribed.
Thank you.
Move for approval?
Second.
I have a motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Ms. Keller. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes, motion carries. Item 5 is the consent agenda. If you'll read this into the record.
Item A, acceptance of the motion summary of the Records Commission meeting held on November 18th, 2018 as recorded and transcribed.
Move for approval of the consent agenda?
Second.
I have a motion by Ms. Keller, second by Mr. Schaefer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes, motion carries. Item 6 is time set aside for anything that is not on tonight's agenda, letters, petitions, or any public comments. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to come forward at this time? If you'll come forward to the microphone, and once you get seated, you can give us your name and address.
Need more parking out there.
Say, let's not go there.
My name is Conrad Young. I live at 758 Executive Boulevard, Delaware, Ohio. And I'm here to discuss the speeding on 7th Executive Boulevard. I came to the last parking and safety meeting, and I have to say that they put some attention to the Executive Boulevard. Their issue is that in the curves, they're going to put some yellow stripes. And they didn't like my recommendation of putting a stop sign at a Rutherford and Executive. But their issue does not speak to the speeding. And I have some documents here that I'd like to show you. You'll have to, each one of you share, each of you two. But Executive Boulevard, they are given attention to the curves. And they declared that there's some side swiping in the curves, so they are gonna put yellow stripes. My issue is not in the curves. If they're speeding in the curves, when they get to that 6.6 of a mile straightaway, that's my concern. If they're going fast in the curves, they're going even faster when they come out of the curves. And, you know, they did do a study that suggests that the overall average is 30-some miles an hour. I'm not concerned with the average. I'm concerned with the straightaway that they use for a drag strip, one car at a time, but, and this is.
Thank you.
Pass, here, let me-
Thank you.
This is a recent wreck in that straightaway, actually across from my house. That car, that parked car was hit by it was right where it's parked there. It was hit by a car coming down Executive towards that car. Went across the road, pushed it 80 feet backwards. If you see the fire hydrant there, pushed it, a parked car, all the way back to the fire hydrant. And the resident there and the police officer had to push the car back up to the parking space. I appreciate the idea of checking to see what the average speed is. That doesn't speak to my problem, what the average speed is in a 24-hour period. It's the time when they're speeding. That was at 12 o'clock at night, that accident. But I hope that the rest of you can see that. But that, you don't push a parked car 80 feet going 30 miles an hour. And that's what is happening. And that happened since the last time I was here. When I was here last, for the purpose of trying to slow them down, I wanted a stop sign on Executive at Rutherford. They said it doesn't, the study suggests that they don't need it. I don't agree with it, that it doesn't need it there. I think a stop sign should be there. One reason is to slow them down in that straightaway. And secondly, in the report, it said that they don't need a stop sign because you can clearly see coming out on Rutherford. Well, that's not true either, especially in the summer. There's obstacles in the way. And if you're pulling out with a car coming 70 miles an hour, or 60 or 50 or whatever they are going, they need a stop sign at Rutherford, at least to slow them down and to prevent people from pulling out with a speeding car coming. So, and I guess the last thing I'll say is I've lived in Delaware for 60 years, and in the northwest side of town, where all the residents, old Delaware, there's stop signs all over the place, every block. And they probably got less traffic than I got on Executive. And I don't understand, you know, the safety and parking said doesn't meet the criteria of some government guidelines. That doesn't make sense to me. If it got them all over the northwest old town, but you can't have them on a street, get one stop sign to slow people down. And it's not true that, especially with speeding cars coming, pulling out of Rutherford, it's dangerous. And secondly, there is obstacles there. You can't see people coming. So anyway, I guess the primary thing, I'd still like to see a stop sign there. And I'm here to say I definitely just want it on record that there's speeding going on and there's children in that area. People are starting to put signs up. We have children on this street, and I think the city at least should put a stop sign there to attempt to shorten the distance of, instead of 0.6 of a mile, cut it down to 0.3, that at least they have to stop. But I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Sir, before you leave, I just want to reply to a couple things. I've chaired that committee for several years, and I agree with you sometimes that I don't always understand why the engineers say it's an unwarranted stop sign. There are some reasons why we don't want to put up unwarranted stop signs, because the studies tell us that when you put up unwarranted stop signs, people tend not to stop for them. That being said, I'd like to ask the city manager to ask the city engineers to reconsider this particular intersection, because it seems to me like it may warrant one. I mean, I don't want to, we've asked them in the past to go against their better judgment, and it hasn't always worked out, but we'll at least ask them to take
Oh, I appreciate that.
another look at this.
But, not to take too much time, but they did 24-hour studies. And there isn't any traffic at 2 o'clock in the morning. I realize that. And they measure how many cars in a 24-hour period. That isn't when the speeders, it's not all night and all day. It's during those peak times.
We have to have some data in order to make decisions whether residential speeding is a problem.
I tried to bring you some today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll follow up with Mr. Farino.
Thanks.
Mhm. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to come forward at this time? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 7, which is committee reports. Anybody have any meetings this week?
We have just a small YMCA update that things are going rather well. There have been a lot of changes that have been made at the YMCA that really indicate their desire to move forward with the city in a good relationship. They're expecting some announcements regarding the rates, new rates for citizens based on some requests that the committee had, that they take a look at the fairness issue.
Mhm.
And they have done that, and they will be making some recommendations. And overall, I think we're ending the year in a much better position through a lot of work and meetings, and Kyle has done so much on that front, so
Very
it's
good.
looking a lot better.
Thank you. Thank you, you and George both for sitting on that, and it's been a tough year. Kyle, thanks for stepping in and help too. Okay, and I think that was it that's all we had this week, I believe. Item 8 is consideration of a liquor permit relating to the stockholder change.
And Chief Pijanowski is not here. He's had a family situation. He's picking up his son, actually, I believe. But he indicates that this is just a recommendation for stockholder change, and we would recommend council's favorable consideration of it. There is a background report from the police department in the packet.
In the packet, okay.
Yeah.
I move for approval of the liquor permit change.
Second.
Motion by Ms. Keller, second by Mr. Farrell. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes, motion carries. Item 9 is the third reading of ordinance number 19-69 as amended.
Ordinance number 19-69 amended, an ordinance making appropriations for the year 2020 and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause that this ordinance is hereby declared to be an emergency measure necessary to provide for the public peace, safety, health, and welfare of the city, and further to provide lawful appropriations available for expenditure by January 1st, 2020, and as such will be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
This is the third and final reading of the city's 2020 appropriations ordinance, which we're recommending council's consideration of. We provided a background memo with the packet on Tuesday, summarizing the very few changes that city council had discussed and agreed to. It was kind of timely that we had citizens' comments tonight, because traffic calming was one of the things that council has added to the budget for next year. So this is the issue of speeding and four-way stops versus traffic calming is something that we're dealing with all the time. And recognizing that, you've asked that we put an additional $19,000 in the budget. That's reflected in there. And then there was some additional changes that we had made as well that we really didn't have a lot of discussion about, but Dean provided the background information for in the memo. So with that said, we would be happy to entertain any questions and would recommend your favorable consideration of the 2020 budget.
Any questions or comments nothing?
I will move for the approval of the emergency clause in ordinance 19-69.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1969 as amended.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Motion carries. Item 10 is the third reading of ordinance number 19-70.
Ordinance number 19-70, an ordinance amending the Delaware Municipal Court and Clerk of Court employee benefits and leave policies and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause, this ordinance is declared to be an emergency measure necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, property, health, safety, and welfare of the city. The emergency clause is required to enact the changes effective on December 25th, 2019. Therefore, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
I can really just say with the next, with the ordinance 1970, 1971, and 1972 are all obviously third readings. There've been no changes, and it's our recommendation that these be given favorable consideration by council. And this, obviously, with the budget now adopted, the funding is in place for the changes.
Recommend approval of the emergency clause on ordinance 1970.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1970.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. And item 11 is the third reading of ordinance number 19-71.
Ordinance number 19-71, an ordinance amending ordinance number 18-111, establishing the pay and benefits for various part-time and intermittent and seasonal employees of the city of Delaware and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause, this ordinance is declared to be an emergency measure necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, property, health, safety, and welfare of the city. The emergency clause is required to enact the changes effective on December 25th, 2019. Therefore, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
Very good. Is there a motion?
Move for approval of the emergency clause on ordinance 1971.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1971.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. And item 12 is the third reading of ordinance number 19-72. If you'll read this in the record, please.
Ordinance number 19-72, an ordinance amending the management, professional, technical, confidential, and supervisory employees pay plan and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause, this ordinance is declared to be an emergency measure necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, property, health, safety, and welfare of the city. The emergency clause is required to enact the changes effective on December 25th, 2019, which coincides with the new calendar year. Therefore, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
Thank you.
Move for the approval of the emergency clause on ordinance 1972.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1972.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes, motion carries. Item 13 is third reading of ordinance number 19-73.
Ordinance number 19-73, an ordinance amending the employment agreement with the city manager and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause, this ordinance is declared to be an emergency measure necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, property, health, safety, and welfare of the city. The emergency clause is required to enact the changes effective to December 25th, 2019. Therefore, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
Any comments? Move for the approval of the emergency clause in ordinance 1973.
We
Second.
should make them sweat a little bit. Come on, you guys are too easy.
We can stick around long.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1973.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Item 14 is third reading of ordinance number 19-74.
Ordinance number 19-74, an ordinance establishing the salary and benefits of the council clerk and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause. This ordinance is declared to be an emergency measure necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, property, health, safety, and welfare of the city. The emergency clause is required to enact the changes effective on December 25th, 2019, which coincides with the new calendar year and the effective date of the management pay plan for 2019. Therefore, this ordinance shall be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
No, we're going to stall this one.
Move for the approval of the emergency clause in 1974.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 19-74.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Motion carries.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then item 15 is second reading of ordinance number 19-76.
Ordinance number 19-76, an ordinance approving a combined preliminary and final development plan for Delaware City Schools for an expansion to Schultz Elementary School located at 499 Applegate Lane on property zoned R4, medium density residential district, which encompasses approximately 36.47 acres.
Thank you. Mr. Eflin?
Madam Mayor, members of council, we would continue to recommend approval, as did your planning commission. The city manager might have an update relative to the roadway discussions that he would like to share with you tonight.
Yeah, we have, I think, reached an agreement in principle where the schools would contribute $175,000 to the construction of this roadway. That's represents about half, about 45% of the base construction cost. We want to put in some safety enhancements, so we'll probably be putting that in our, I don't know if that'll be in our capital budget and our operating budget in 2021, but the schools are also obligated to pay fees to the city, both capacity and impact fees. Those total about close to $40,000. So that was really kind of outside of, during the discussions with the schools, they made the argument, and I can understand this, that their bond levy really is for academic space. It's to increase classrooms and provide academic settings. But I think as they have been in the past, they were a willing partner. And this will actually, once we complete this connection, will improve the traffic network in and around Schultz Elementary School. And that's a good thing for our community in the long term. Councilwoman Keller asked me whether we would name this Cobblestone or would this be Pennock. So maybe that's to be decided at some point. But anyway, I think we've come to an agreement on that, and we'll be sharing that. Obviously, we can discuss that more in our joint meeting with the school board in February. But that's my update.
We joked about that during planning too, what to name it. I think we should combine the two names, but whatever.
Kovelnick?
Gobbledygook, that's what I had.
Do we have to decide on the name tonight?
No, we do not.
I'll move to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings on ordinance 1976.
Can we pause for just a second? I'm sorry. My only concern is that I really wish that this plan included more parking. I was talking to the city manager today, and we were trying to figure out, during all of these additions to the schools, when the last time the parking was expanded. Is there?
There is a representative here from the schools, I think, the architect, and I don't know if their planning director has an answer to that question, but,
You look so happy coming up here.
Thanks. I'm Zach Price with Triad Architects. My address is 328 North Liberty Street here in Delaware. The exact number of parking that was added during the last round of capital improvements, I honestly am not sure what that is, but my understanding is there was
Okay.
some expansion added at that time. This current plan allows for the relocation of the buses to be moved, of course, off of that new extension. So it's actually allowing better circulation for pickup and drop-off, both at where the existing pickup and drop-off currently is, as well as the lot to the east. We've done traffic studies and sat out front and counted cars before and after school, and we believe that this would actually alleviate a lot of the backup on the roads there.
I agree. I mean, I think that the change with the buses will help a ton with that. My concern is just the everyday, day-to-day parking that tends to spill over into the neighborhood. Is that an everyday problem, do you think, or a special event only problem?
I was actually at the school, I think for a Secret Santa
Yes.
this past Saturday, and I did notice that there was some cars parked on the surrounding streets, but there were actually quite a few spaces available in that lot to the east. I didn't have any parking issues myself.
Okay.
So, I don't know if that addresses your
So
answer
was
your question.
adding parking discussed at all, or just not part of this plan?
Not part of this plan.
Okay,
So.
okay, thank you. It's not a deal breaker, I just would like to see it. The other thing that seems crazy to me is that we make the schools pay capacity and impact fees for the capacity and impact that we're forcing them to deal with.
we're gonna turn to Mr. Effling, because we spent some time on this during the last round of.
We did, relative to parking, I just agree with Zach, and I'd say, Councilwoman Keller, that we can continue to have discussions with the schools to raise your issue. Obviously, some of the schools in the district are in pretty compact areas of the community and just may not be able to accommodate more parking, but I'll make sure to raise that issue with them as well, as I'm sure Zach will. As well, in terms of capacity impact fees, during the last bond levy in 2013, we'd had a lot of discussions with the schools and then Superintendent Paul Kraft relative to that issue. We took a very specific analysis approach to both capacity fees and impact fees that really broke down, in the case of impact fees, using the building plans, gave them as much consideration as possible in terms of taking out hallways and that sort of thing, not counting those, not counting a place where a kid couldn't be twice, and that sort of thing. Our impact fee regulations, as you know, require the payment of impact fees regardless of who it is, and if you were to waive those, the city would simply have to pay itself basically into the impact fee fund by our regulations. So we felt like that was a good compromise. Capacity fees, there was a big spreadsheet with a lot of formulas in it relative, and we looked at actual usage, and we really tried to break that down and give them as much consideration as possible. I understand your concern, but that's sort of the same approach with capacity fees, that everybody pays their fair share. I think they were supportive last time, and I believe in the city manager's report they're supportive of moving forward with utilizing the same methodology this time.
Are there any communities that exempt their schools from?
Well, we're one of the only communities in the state that has this type of impact fees set up.
Yeah.
So it'd be hard to know. Not sure.
Okay.
It's difficult, Councilwoman, because in Ohio, there's no enabling legislation for impact fees in particular, and so we're operating under home rule doctrine, basically, for impact fees and the imposition of them. Some other states have enabling legislation that call for different kinds of things. I don't see that happening anytime in Ohio soon, so that's something in talking to our national consultant that helped us put these in place and did the analysis and the defensibility that I think, at least my recollection, Tom, is the last time we spoke with him, that we find a way to impose the impact fees, but in a very fair and reasonable way to this particular user.
Okay.
Okay, I think you made a motion.
I made a motion to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings on ordinance 19-76.
Second.
Second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 19-76.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. And thank you, thank you. Item 16 is second reading of ordinance number 19-77.
Ordinance number 19-77, an ordinance for Westport Homes approving an amended preliminary subdivision plat for Springer Woods, Section 3 on approximately 47.5 acres containing 121 single-family lots on property zoned R3, one family residential district, and located on the north side of West William Street, US 36, and south of Warrensburg Road.
Thank you. Mr. Eflin?
And Madam Mayor, members of council, we continue to recommend approval, as did your planning commission unanimously. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions?
I'll move to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings on 1977.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of ordinance 1977.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Jones. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Motion carries. And item 17 and 18 can be read together. Ordinances number 19-78 and 1979.
Ordinance number 19-78, an ordinance approving a final development plan request by Medrock LLC for Willowbrook Section 3 containing 88 single-family lots on approximately 22.5 acres on property zoned R3 and R6, one family residential district and multi-family residential district, and located on the north and south side of Boulder Drive between Minton Drive and Firestone Drive. In ordinance number 19-79, an ordinance approving a final subdivision plat request by Medrock LLC for Willowbrook Section 3 containing 88 single-family lots on approximately 22.5 acres on property zoned R3 and R6, one family residential district and multi-family residential district, and located on the north and south side of Boulder Drive between Minton Drive and Firestone Drive.
Thank you. Mr. Eflin?
Madam Mayor, members of council, we continue to recommend approval of this, and your planning commission recommended unanimous approval. Happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Any comments or questions from Mr. Eflin?
I move to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings on ordinance 1978.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Jones, second by Mr. Schaefer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for approval of ordinance 1978.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Jones, second by Mr. Schaefer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
I move to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings on ordinance 1979.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Jones, second by Mr. Schaefer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yep.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes. For the approval of
Mayor
ordinance
Riggle.
1979.
Excuse me.
Second.
Sorry.
Motion by Mr. Jones, second by Mr. Schaefer. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Catch breath. Number 19 is consideration of ordinance number 19-81.
Ordinance number 19-81, an ordinance supplementing the 2019 appropriations ordinance and declaring an emergency. Emergency clause, if this ordinance is hereby declared to be an emergency measure necessary to provide for the public peace, safety, health, and welfare of the city, and for the further reason that such action is necessary to provide for purchases through the end of the fiscal year being December 31st, 2019, and as such will be in full force and effect immediately upon its passage.
Mr. Stelzer.
Thank you. Before I forget, wanted to make council aware, at least 5 of you, the next pay period, which will be, I think, December 31st, you won't be receiving a city paycheck. If you recall, late last year, we had that option of that 27th pay period. It was actually scheduled to be in 2019, but it came to council because we had a pretty good budget year, and we, for all the other city employees, we moved it into 2018, so we had 27 pay periods in 2018. 2019 is the 27 pay period for council, and since your pay ordinance is fixed at an annual amount, can't pay you more than that annual amount. With your last pay, you got up to that annual amount that's in your pay ordinance. So
We worked 2 weeks for nothing?
well, that's, you know, it's a good thing here. This is the last meeting of the year. See, you're not going to do anything the rest of the year, right?
Gifts for the kids this Christmas.
I know, bah humbug. For the 2 new council members, obviously it doesn't apply. They weren't here earlier in the year, so they will receive their.
Oh, come on.
And if you stay on council long enough, that'll probably happen in 7 years or so. But again,
I think the only fair thing to do is divide it up.
Okay.
we can do that if you let us know in advance, so we can divvy it up amongst the others. Just let us know.
I'd say take us out to dinner, but there wouldn't be enough.
The year-end supplemental provided a memo outlining the changes that are necessary. Not a lot there that was out of the ordinary. The big ticket item, the $900,000 with our health insurance fund, we talked a little bit about that. I kind of previewed that. I knew that was coming for quite some time. As you may or may not be aware, we do self-fund our health insurance. We pay stop-loss premiums for any individual claims that go over $190,000. It'll soon be $100,000 or more a year. That insurance costs us almost $1 million a year, and it's been going up because we've had quite a few high claims. But with our self-funded program, you know, it's over the long haul. We've had many, many good years where we've had pretty decent claim history. Last 2, we've been up on the high end, and at some point, hopefully, that transitions. Other than that, rather than going through some of the supplementals, I'll just leave it up. If you have specific questions about any of them, I can address those in more detail.
Any questions? Any motions? You said no?
I'll move to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings of ordinance 19-81.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Farrell. Good job. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes.
Move for the approval of the emergency clause on ordinance 1981.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Farrell. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Motion
And
carries.
finally, I'll move for the approval of ordinance 19-81.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Schaefer, second by Mr. Farrell. Roll call, please.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mrs. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Farrell?
Yes.
Mr. Hellinger?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Schaefer?
Yes.
Mayor Riggle?
Yes. Thank you. City managers report.
Just a couple of things, real quickly. The work session for the 6th of January, the packet will be going out on Tuesday, because Wednesday is, I believe, the 1st or the 31st. And so just recognizing that we have kind of a short week, we'll get that out in advance. So that will be coming your way that Tuesday. I will be out of the office, out of town actually from Saturday through Thursday of next week. Kyle will be our acting city manager during that time. Orientation for the 2 new council members has been scheduled for the 30th, half day. And we're also going to take advantage of the Citizens Academy and as an opportunity to see some of our facilities. So we'll make sure we coordinate with Lee and his efforts to give our 2 new councilmen the opportunity to see some of the various facilities. And there was some discussion earlier before the meeting about doing another tour of the city.
Mhm.
We did one a few years ago when we were scouting for a dog park, I think.
Yes.
And we went everywhere, and we won't have the same agenda this time, but just getting around and familiarizing ourselves with the growth and where it's occurring, I think will be beneficial. So we'll get that set up for some time in the first part of the year. And the state of the city this year is going to be in the form of a video. And Mr. Yoakum and his staff, Dale, have been working on that. And that will be, we'll hopefully council will get a preview of that before it goes for the Chamber of Commerce. But Mayor Riggle and I were part of that yesterday, and I know a number of the directors are as well. So looking forward to that. I just want to thank City Council for their support this year, and obviously the work that we do, the various initiatives that we've taken, and for approving the budget tonight and all the various other actions you took. I also want to recognize the directors for the hard work that they do, and the people that work with them and for them. And I look forward to a productive 2020. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us. We continue to be a growing community, and there's a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of important issues that we have to address. So we'll be hopefully tackling those head on next year in 2020. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Council comments. Mr. Jones.
Just echo what Tom just said. Thanks to staff and everybody for, I think it was a great year. I want to thank everybody for your support for my son last couple of weeks. Appreciate that, and just wish everybody a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and Happy Holidays, and all that stuff. That's it.
Mrs. Keller.
I was speaking to the city manager a little earlier about the work session, and he suggested that I just make the recommendation publicly that when the presentation is given, it seems to make sense to me that the group that requested the study, Delaware Now, has representation at the work session, so that if we have questions,
Sure.
there'll be someone available there to answer them.
Okay.
And then everyone just have a wonderful vacation. I guess we'll be doing it unpaid. 5 of us will enjoy a lovely unpaid vacation, but Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I look forward to working with you all in 2020.
Okay. Mr. Hopper.
I'd first just like to thank you all for helping Drew and I not blow up the city in our first couple weeks here. And I also wanted to touch on what Mr. Conrad Young spoke about tonight. Vice Mayor Schaefer, having served on that committee for a long time. I'm not a traffic engineer or anything, but the case he makes tonight, just to me, seems reasonable.
Mhm.
I don't know what kind of technical analysis you gotta have a stop sign, and, maybe with, as he says, not everybody's speeding down the street, but you have a couple of bad apples, and I guess just my intuition is
people who are inclined to speed, maybe they're not gonna do a complete stop at the stop sign, but it's like a big red sign, you know what I mean? So maybe they slow down a little bit, maybe they, so I just thought he made a good case and was the sort of, I wanna say, civic-minded citizen that we wanna have come to our council meeting, and I hope we consider what he said. And with all that, I hope everybody has a happy holiday season.
Thank you. Mr. Farrell?
To echo everyone else, and especially Corey, I think I appreciate the welcome, the orientation, and the toleration of mistakes when we make them. Also, I wanted to thank the police department. I had a car drive through a utility pole and land in my front yard over the weekend, and they stood out in the cold rain for about 4 hours digging through the rubble. So that was awesome of them, and they got the power company, the water company, everybody out to inspect everything within a few hours, and I got to stand inside and watch and not get wet. So I really appreciate them doing that. It's the fastest response I've ever gotten from the cable company, which was also great.
I'll stay on council, no, just kidding.
Yeah, and I didn't even tell them who I was, so.
Well, they know.
So that was really appreciated. And other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season the next couple weeks.
So did you lose power and all your
No,
neighbors?
nothing.
Okay, I was just curious.
So he just took out the pole and somehow
Okay.
the wire stayed attached, so.
Interesting. Mr. Hellinger?
Just with regards to Mr. Conrad, is my neighbor on the other side of the S curve, on Executive. And not to speak specific to that, but in overall terms, you know, it's, work from home, look out that window every day and see cars going by. Some go fast, some go slow, some are really loud and appear to go faster because of their noise. But at the end of the day, you know, the majority of the traffic in any neighborhood originates or terminates in that neighborhood. And the best way that, we can't put up stop signs everywhere, we can't put up speed bumps, we can't do whatever, have 100 police cars out there. The best way that every citizen can work to do traffic calming in their neighborhood is to drive the speed limit when they're in their neighborhood and every other neighborhood. If you're going down Liberty and it's 25, don't be going 35 and then complain when somebody does 35 going up your street, which is also a 25. You know, the best way we can get in front of that is it has to be community enforced. And I'll tell you what, I'll pull right out in front of somebody I see coming through that S-turn going fast. I'll get right out in front of them and slow them down. Because you know what? Hey, I'm doing 25. I'm not going to go slower than 25, but I'll do 25. Do 25 on every residential street, and that's the only way. But people always think that I want you to go slow in my neighborhood, but I'm going to go 30 or 35 in somebody else's neighborhood. That's the crux of the problem. So, that's all I got.
Thank you. Mr. Schaefer?
I will echo everyone else's comments to wish Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, whatever you prefer. And I think looking back, we've got a lot of good things accomplished in the past year. You know, we don't always agree on everything, but somehow we get it done. And I think next year we've got a lot of good opportunities ahead of us. Some of those will be brilliantly disguised as challenges, but I think they'll be fun. So I look forward to whatever comes. Happy New Year, everybody.
And I would just like to thank staff and city manager for a great year. It's been really amazing this year, I think. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas to all of you. I will be traveling. I'm in Florida and then Philly, so you're up.
I'll be here.
I haven't gotten all of the committee assignments done yet. I've been extremely busy at work, and I will hopefully have a little bit of downtime over the holidays to try my best to get that done. So with that, I will look for a motion to adjourn.
So.
We are adjourned at 7:49.